we go. So we had 2 presentations at the Digital Commons Conference last year in Berkeley on electronic theses and dissertations, henceforth ETDs, when Amy Reese at the University of Alabama, Birmingham shared about her ETD roundup. She described the process of collecting and collating theses and dissertations from at least 4 separate silos and all of their associated accoutrements so that they could be added to the repository. Denise Brush at Rowan University shared their process for transforming an XML export to make the addition of their ETDs as streamlined a process as possible. Both of these presentations looked at one way of getting ETDs into the repositories. So this year I thought, why not talk about the other ways of doing this? And that process that they've been using is the batch upload. But there are other routes that can be taken that will result in ETDs getting into the repository as direct a route as possible. And we'll take a closer look at the tools that Digital Commons has that can help streamline this process for you. So let's do what a lot of people do and look at the end result. So my alma mater gives out lollipops when graduate students submit their culminating projects, and it's become the occasion for lots of strategically posed and located selfies with and without their pieces of candy. And it's a fun way to see the end of what can be the longest and most stressful experience of a student's career up till that point. And it's images that demonstrate where we all really want to end up when it comes to ETDs, namely with happy students who are done with the writing and the revision and the submission, and faculty and administrators who have confirmed that all of their requirements are met and that it's basically time to party with the students and celebrate their launch down the runway and out into the community of scholars. So when we say ETDs, what we really mean for this audience are those culminating projects that are produced by students to meet their degree requirements at all levels. These are most often, in our case, in master's theses and doctoral dissertations, but they include things like undergraduate honors theses, final portfolio projects, especially for architecture and design students, senior recitals, master's degree performances and exhibitions, culminating poster presentations. We see a lot of those, especially with our nursing programs, and capstone projects of other sorts and various types that are all determined by those various degree requirements for those programs. And so those are the things that you're seeing here on this slide, which is the homepage and community landing pages for student work. Digital Commons clients are rightly proud of the student work that you're sharing in your repositories, and you're showcasing them on your sites. Showcasing the student work can also be a recruiting tool for the institution because it illustrates for prospective students the kind of work that they can be expected to and also inspired to produce. So Cal Poly Humboldt is highlighting the departments that make up their collection. The University of Kentucky's landing page for student work not only lists out their degree types, but also includes their student journals as well as award-winning papers. Otterbein University shows all of the types of theses that they award, and Bates College, which is an undergraduate-only institution, is featuring their theses and capstones on their homepage. And other institutions, some of which are here, I've seen you showcase student research conferences, art exhibits, podcasts, as well as coursework. And that's all a long way of saying that student work and ETDs, like we talked about yesterday and on Tuesday, they're a foundational collection for any repository. Continuing my nod to our 2 presenters last year, here we're seeing the fruits of the labors of both Amy and Denise. Their chosen workflow is the most direct way to get an ETD into the repository. You batch upload the metadata in the full text file, any associated or supplemental files that may be associated with it, and then queue it for posting. All of the work of the submission, review, and approval has been done before it gets to the library. The final copy is deposited with the library, and the now former student has a record of their scholarship out in the world. I also want to note here on Rowan's page the information that they've included about the temporal extent of their collection and how items of various ages may be accessed, including as much information about the disposition of and access to any collection is always helpful, especially as Amy pointed out to us last year, when ETD collections have been in a range of formats and come from various locations. But there are other ways to get ETDs into the repository and other ways to meet those submission and review requirements. And it's at this point where our conversation is going to turn to looking at those built-in tools that are in Digital Commons. So depending on the needs and preferred processes or requirements of the degree programs, graduate division, and the library, a more complex process can take shape. Flight paths like what we're about to see are what many Digital Commons clients are using for their ETDs, and you'll likely see parts of your own processes for managing ETDs in the next few slides. So the process is this. The student submits to the repository their approved final copy that has been signed off on by all their advisors, and then the library staff reviews the submission and posts it. In these images, you can see at the left the initial submission down at the very bottom, and then the student made a quick revision, and then the library staff member takes over the work and makes adjustments to the record before it's posted. You can see in the revision history at the right, if it's big enough for you, especially in the back, that each version of the PDF that is uploaded is retained in the record, along with a record of the revisions that were made to the document. The administrator can then select the version that should be available for download in the public record. So this particular example has been anonymized, but lurking behind those initials that you can see is, it's the library staff that's doing the work here. The student submits, then it's all with the library. The revisions that are preserved in this record are actions like correcting the name of the director of graduate studies, adding some keywords to help with search, and adjusting margins. The person doing this work might be the repository administrator, it might be a metadata librarian. However that work needs doing, it can be divided up and assigned to that person so that it is completed. So second verse, a little different from the first. The screenshots on this slide are looking pretty similar to what we just saw. We're seeing here a student making the submission, they've made a revision, and then we're seeing a few more actions that were taken. And it's here where we're seeing even more of those tools that are part of Digital Commons coming into play, and where the flexibility of the platform can let you have whatever levels of involvement and coordination needed between the library, the graduate division, and any other offices that may need to be involved. So what we see here is a workflow that, as usual, starts with a student, but then it goes first to the graduate division, and then it goes to the library. The built-in tools in Digital Commons allow for, one, the graduate division to receive an email notification when a new submission is received. Two, the users in the graduate division to log in and see only those structures that they have been given permission to manage, and in some cases, only specific functions for those structures. Three, the graduate division administrator can correspond with the student to request edits and additional information. And four, the graduate administrator can then send the record over to the library for its final processing and posting. And those of you that may have worked with the peer review tools in Digital Commons will be saying, yes, this is looking very familiar. As Pramita said earlier, the infrastructure of Digital Commons is journal software, and that's what we've got here. These review tools can be enabled for any structure in Digital Commons. Todd just mentioned the book galleries and the image galleries. You can enable peer review tools for those as well. Any structure where you want to use it, they can be turned on. But where we see it most commonly outside of journals is here in ETDs as well as in event communities. So one of the actions that you can see here that has the comment of, if you can see it, do I have a pointer on this? It's blurry, I know. It's accepted with a request for a minor revision. By enabling this, using this option, then the administrator can send an email to the student with instructions for whatever next steps they need to take. The correspondence between the administrator and the student uses templated emails that are stored in the platform, and these emails can be customized to include whatever instructions or links to formatting templates that may be needed. And different ETD structures can all have their own templates with their own instructions. These workflows will all depend on the degree, on the requirements for that degree or program. And just like with journals, requests for revisions can continue as long as needed. You can revise and resubmit as many times as you want. We just see 2 in this example. And then once the graduate division administrator is satisfied that all the formatting and the other requirements that they care about, they can send it over to the library where it can be posted. This sort of shared workflow, especially here in this example, does have several steps. We're seeing a lot more actions recorded than we did in the previous example, but you can see how this work is shared among the 3 parties that are responsible for getting the thesis not only into the repository, but through and then to public sharing. And the timeline for this particular example was 2 weeks. So that last slide had a more detailed workflow than what we're looking at here. The actions that are recorded in this example are the submission by the student, a little bit of zhuzhing by the library administrator, and then the posting of the thesis. So the revision that we're seeing here that the library administrator did was accessibility remediation. And as we've heard yesterday and both Tuesday, accessibility is a topic of some concern for all of us. And so this institution has included that here in the submission and review workflow. We'll see in a few slides how else accessibility compliance can be included in the ETD process. The work in this example is being done just by 2 people without using the review tools to indicate that the thesis has been completed and accepted like we saw in the last example. Instead of those review tools, there's also the option to enable a checklist within the structure, and that can be ticked off by the administrator as each step is completed. This publication checklist option is not enabled by default. It's something that you need to request from your consulting services representative, and they can give you much more information about how to use that. All right, so now stick with me. This is the last boring slide. Now we're moving on to the most involved example of how an ETD can be managed in the platform. So in this example, a mostly finished draft is submitted by the student, and then the library administrator assigns it to the person who will be checking on its progress. Then the ETD gets sent out for review using those tools that we were just talking about. The review tools, because they were designed for journal publishing, can be set for double or single blind reviewing. But most, if not all, of the caveats about anonymizing a document can be overlooked in this case, since we hope the panel of faculty advisors and reviewers will be familiar with the student and the document. Requesting the review in Digital Commons will send an email to that faculty advisor, and the advisor can then accept the request, and all of that information gets recorded. They'll be able to download the document, review it, and do what they need to do with it. Those of you that are familiar with the Digital Commons journals, those reminder emails that go out to reviewers, those can also be enabled here. So the administrator can set a review deadline and opt to send those friendly reminders to the advisors through the platform rather than doing that work outside of the platform. Outside of the platform, the student thesis defense is scheduled and held, and what's also not recorded in this example are any comments and notes that may have been generated by the faculty reviewer or advisor with the student. But just like with journals, faculty comments on the draft thesis can be transmitted and shared back with the student through the platform. The image on the right is showing us the status of each review. And in this particular institution, they're not seeking to record the completion of the review process. They know that's happening in the thesis defense. You can see that they're just looking to make sure that the review was sent, it was received, and that the work is happening outside of the platform. And then at the bottom in the center, that's the review history. You'll see it's short, or the revision history, and it's been handled by the student. They uploaded the document, and then there's a note that the post-thesis recommended changes were made. With any of these examples that we've looked at, there can, of course, be variations depending on your own institution's departmental requirements. Larger institutions may opt to have an individual department administrator to ensure their particular requirements are met, or the amount of work is large enough that it warrants a department handling it independently. And some institutions may be small enough, or the staffing is limited enough that that whole process of getting the submission email and sending things out for review is just handled by one person. And that's all a long way of saying that the review tools are really, really flexible, and they can accommodate pretty much any workflow. All right, so now let's take a look at how this process can be streamlined before the submission is made to the repository. The repository itself can be a resource for students as they're preparing their submissions, serving as a home for any document templates, guidelines, and other reference items. The landing pages for ETDs in the repository can also be really helpful troves of information. You can see that Cal Poly Humboldt has done that. They've added all of their submission deadlines, links to their resources, their templates, even some basic submission instructions. On the right, you can see the library site for Otterbein University, which is also a really great resource for ETDs. And it's listing not just where they can be found. Otterbein is choosing, like a lot of Ohio schools do, to have their graduate ETDs added to the Ohio Link ETD database, as well as having them in the repository. But for meeting accessibility requirements, those formatting guidelines that you're seeing at the bottom right include how to ensure that a submission meets the accessibility requirements that Otterbein is asking their students to comply with the ideal result that accessibility remediation action we saw a few slides ago that was handled by the library administrator, that work is being done in the pre-submission state by the student. Of course, you can, as administrators, can still check to make sure that those requirements were met, but that initial work, they've turned it over and made it the student's responsibility rather than the library's responsibility. The work of ensuring that requirements are met can be handled as part of the submission process, even more so. The submission form for ETDs is infinitely customizable, and any number of fields can be added and made required to help ensure that submissions are complete. The first step to streamline this part of this process can be setting up single sign-on. Again, I'm picking on Cal Poly Humboldt. They've got their SSO on their login page. And then once a student is in, they can make sure they've got all the things they need to submit. Here in this collection of submission forms, we're seeing reminders that a student needs signatures, an oral defense requirement, approvals for using animals and/or human subjects, submission of processing fees, and in that line there's a link to a third-party payment site, so that payment does go to the graduate division. Adding signature pages as an additional file, and that additional file can be set so that's not part of the public record, but it's part of the record that's only available to administrators. And what we're not seeing here are other things like accessibility requirements and anything else that you want to make sure the student is doing, or at least checking off before they make a submission. So in short, the submission form can be its own checklist for the student. The consulting services team has a lot of experience with customizing these pages, and they can get really creative to help you make sure that your students are able to make a complete submission that has all the information you need, that will involve as little editing on your part as possible going forward. All right. In these last two slides, I want to recall those happy smiling students that we saw earlier on and those smooth flights, and look at some posted theses and what they can offer. So first, embargoes, which you can see on the left in the dissertation from the University of Kentucky. Embargoes can be set up to be in effect for specific timeframes, like 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. Or the student or administrator can select a specific date on which the embargo will expire. The second item is an ORCID ID. The University of Kentucky has long championed ORCID IDs, not just for their faculty, but also for their graduate students. And they've also been minting DOIs for their ETDs. And all of this helps ensure that a student, once they leave the institution, can have their thesis or capstone project as part of their scholarly portfolio from the start, and that it will travel with them regardless of the institution they end up at. The University of Kentucky also encourages, where they can, students to enter an alternate email address that will be active after their graduation, so that the students can continue to get those monthly download emails so they can see, they can track the usage of their thesis. On the right, we're seeing Nova Southeastern University. They have opted to apply access controls on their ETD collections, and this is an option that's available to you too. You may already have that in place. This is largely dependent on your institution's policies. Most interestingly for me is the options on the right. they have this free the thesis option. And this is so that students can opt in to make their thesis open access. If you look closely in the middle image, you can see that some of these, the bottom two theses on that page are NSU access only, but that top one is open access, so that student has opted to do that. And both Nova, Southeastern, and the University of Kentucky have included a contact the author button. So if someone doesn't want to log in or the thesis is still under embargo, they can still contact the author directly and see about getting a copy or at least getting more information about the record. And then to log out, finish up, close out. It's been a long conference, you guys. I just want to end with a story that's an oldie but a goodie. Some of you may have already heard this. There is a thesis, a senior thesis, an undergraduate thesis at Claremont McKenna College. It was posted to their repository late in 2013, and it was on female body image and social media. And since then, it's been discovered a lot. Not too long after its publication, it got found and cited by Elle magazine, and that started its tremendous download trajectory. In the 12 years since it was posted, it has continued to be circulated and downloaded and cited. You can see that it's closing in on now 325,000 downloads. And 3 years ago, it had kind of a revival with a second round of media mentions back when TikTok was the dominant social media platform. Not every ETD class is going to have usage metrics like this. But what I like about this story is how it shows the impact of the work that you all are doing with your ETDs. Those detailed workflows will result in ETDs getting out there and to the public. The end result, which is what we want, is a piece of scholarship that can inform and affect maybe tens of people, maybe hundreds of people, maybe even thousands. We've talked over the past 2 days, about how foundational ETDs and student work are to a repository, and we spent, a fair amount of time looking at some pretty detailed workflows. But it's the result and the impact of the work that we've invested into those workflows that I want to leave you with here with this story, and how digital commons can be the runway for a student to then launch themselves out into the stratosphere of scholarship. So thanks, and I'll look forward to your questions in the Q&A.